want to welcome Professor Ilan Stavans from Amherst. And before I introduce him properly, I want to say a couple of words about the occasion. This is actually our one endowed lectureship. Maybe we'll have another one or two someday, but right now this is it. It's the 22nd annual Yedida Kalfon Stillman Memorial Lecture, which was established through the generosity of her family, friends, and colleagues to honor the memory of Yedida Kalfon Stillman, who was a world-renowned scholar who died in February 1998. The first memorial lecture was given in 2001 by Professor Paula Sanders of Rice, who was introduced by then President Boren. The memorial lecturers have all been extremely distinguished scholars in fields generally related to Professor Kalfon Stillman's wide-ranging interests in the Middle East, Sephardic history, and language. I can't understand why it took me 7 years to land on Professor Stavans for this lectureship, but it did. Professor Yedida Kalfon Stillman was born in Morocco, raised in Israel. She and Noam Stillman worked together for many years at Binghamton University in New York. Same weather zone as Professor Stavans, and together founded the Judaic Studies program here at the University of Oklahoma. Yedida authored several of the definitive studies in her field, including Arab headdress from the birth of Islam to modern times, and her works are still widely read, widely cited, and for this non-pandemic times, I would be happy to hold them up and display them along with Professor Stavans' works. So now I'd like to introduce our lecturer this evening. Born in Mexico, Ilan Stavans' first language was Yiddish. He subsequently moved into other linguistic environments, including Spanish, Hebrew, English, Ladino, and Spanglish. He is currently the Lewis Sebring Professor of Humanities and Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College. He is also the co-founder and publisher of Restless Books, an independent nonprofit publishing house based in Brooklyn, dedicated to translations of extraordinary world literature, republishing the classics for underserved populations, and championing immigrant writers. He's the co-founder and academic director of the Great Books program, which brings teenagers from all over the world to campuses in the US, Europe, and China to engage with the classics. He's hosted In Contrast, an NPR podcast. He has translated Jorge Luis Borges and Pablo Neruda into English. His neighbor, Emily Dickinson, and Elizabeth Bishop into Spanish, Yehuda Halevi and Yehuda Amichai from Hebrew, Isaac Bashevis Singer from Yiddish, and Shakespeare and Cervantes into Spanglish. Recipient of numerous international awards and honors, his work, translated into 20 languages, has been adapted into film, TV, theater, and radio. As you will guess, the most difficult thing about inviting Professor Stavans to speak is exercising due process of elimination and finding something that he can't speak about, which is not so easy. After some fun back and forth, Professor Stavans has chosen for his lecture title tonight, A Tourist Guide Through Heaven and Hell, Explorations of the Afterlife in Jewish Culture. I want to just finally, before turning it over, I want to thank Trice Hyman, who as always handles all of the technology, all of the bureaucracy, all of the administrative stuff so magnificently, and really over the last couple of years in this pandemic has been just essential to the operations of our center. And I want to also thank my my friends and colleagues at World Literature Today, RFC, Cohen Davis Undiano, and Daniel Simon, who've helped co-sponsor Professor Stavans' visit tonight and this afternoon, which was a great discussion. But I'm sure if Trice hasn't already posted it, he will have posted it by the time we're done with this ice storm. So with that's enough ado, my gosh. After that 8 minutes of ado, let me give you Professor Ilan Stavans.
Thank you very much, Alan. I am grateful and humbled by the introduction and by the invitation. My thanks to you and to RC and to Daniel and to everybody who has made this possible. And I salute the tradition into which now I'm part of delivering this lecture, not only of Professor Stillman, but of my predecessors in all of us establishing a chorus and a choir that reflects on Jewish culture from a variety of perspectives. And in particular, I want to celebrate the Sephardic side of looking at Jewish culture in the Jewish studies in the academy, in spite of the strong efforts to diversify the landscape of how we look at Jewish life. This remains, unfortunately, a lesser field of study and a culture that doesn't receive the type of attention that one would hope, especially given the importance that it has in the shaping of Jewish history. And I feel proud to be able to establish a dialogue with you in that context, though my reflections, coming as they do from a Mexican Jew of Sephardic background, with Yiddish as the main lens through which to appreciate the world, in other aspects, other languages as well, brings in Sephardic culture in this particular moment, in this particular talk, as you will see, only marginally, but we can bring it in other aspects as well. I very much would like to visit heaven and hell. I would like to be a tourist in heaven or in hell. I emphasize the word tourist because I am not talking about dying and going to either or, but about that capacity that science fiction and maybe simply imaginary travel allows us to explore regions that are far beyond our own constraints. You will tell me that heaven and hell do not exist and that it is impossible to visit them. And I will respond to you that neither does Yoknepathaupa County, as created by Faulkner, or Macondo, as created by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. These are also fictional places, and yet incredibly well surveyed and scanned. After many years of rereading 100 Years of Solitude, I almost can tell you where a single tree or the train station or the train of the thread of blood that goes from one character to another is located in the landscape. We in life end up being quite acquainted with the places we live in, to the point that we could close our eyes and almost make it to the office step by step, surveying everything that is around us. And we can do the same when we fall in love passionately and obsessively with an absent place, with an imaginary place, with a non-existent place. I am presenting heaven and hell as if they were maybe joyful, entertaining, and innocent places. But obviously, they are far more than that. they play each of them a central role in a number of different religions, so much so that the eschatology of those religions is as important in some cases as the here and now that they have. In other words, the promise of either visiting as a tourist or as a sinner or as a triumphant winner, the landscape of heaven and the landscape of hell, the promise itself is so integral to a number of religions, particularly the religions, the three Abrahamic religions, that it's the very structure, the scaffolding of them. It would fall apart without these entities. But what is it really that heaven is about, and what is it that hell is about? What is it that when I was growing up in Mexico, whenever somebody said, oh, when you die, you go to heaven, or if you perform the wrong acts, you go to hell, geographically using the hand to automatically point in the direction of the sky as the place, or the above as the place where you ascend to, up high, beyond the stars, and that it is below, the underneath, the underground, the secret pathways that are under our feet, where hell would be located, geographically very clearly defined. Just as I was magically taken when I was little with the concept that the future, and people using again their hand to signify that if something was going to happen, it would happen in the future, and if something had happened, it would happen in the past. Forward looking is what is yet to come. Backward looking is what has already taken place. Maybe that has to do with our anatomy, with the way the body is built, with the place that the eyes have in the face and the nose and the mouth, and the fact that we walk frontally and forwardly, and that we don't walk as some animals or mollusks do backwards, and so that we see what is in front of us as ahead, and what we don't see is behind. And because when we are no longer here, we get buried down, and the concept that there's a division between body and soul, the soul separating itself in Jewish tradition in those 7 days that entail the Shiva, and beginning a journey of ascendance that take it back to what? God or heaven, or that primordial landscape where things are beyond time and space, waiting for something to happen. I know very well that such a visit to heaven and hell is but a goal or a dream or an escapade. Those places are magical and they are ingrained in me, but they are non-visitable. It's not a place that I will go. And yet the older I get, the more I think of them, and the more I reflect on how others before me, and likely others after me, will think about them. Growing up in Mexico, a member of a small Jewish enclave, I found myself at the crossroads, or at the forking paths of two different religious views: the Catholic Christian and the Jewish, Ashkenazi, Eastern European, and with them also the syncretism that Mexico proposed, both to the Jews that were arriving from Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, where the idea of replacing the shtetl and the ghetto and the mujik for the campesino or the mestizo or the Mexican landscape, allowed for all sorts of reinventions, and likewise for the concept that Mexican Catholicism is and isn't the Catholicism of Spain. It's its own creation that results from all sorts of negotiations with the indigenous contribution from the Aztec and the Maya empires and collectivities, and the arrival in 1492 of the Spanish view of religion. I remember very vividly my first trip running away from my family into Spain in my late teens, and entering a number of churches and monasteries in different parts of Spain, just to see how similar, how different were they to the churches and monasteries in Mexico that I had been, that I had visited, or that I had been part of through some friends or some colleagues of my parents, and recognizing that the facial expression of Christ images in those churches and monasteries was dramatically more vivid, graphic than the ones that in Mexico, than the ones that I was encountering in Spain. For some reason, to this day, the facial gesture of the Jesus on the cross in Mexico strikes me as expressing a kind of suffering, a kind of a misery that is incredibly well articulated. See how I'm suffering, see what misery I'm going through, and not only see it in my facial expression, see it also in the spilling of the blood that I have from the crown of thorns, or from the nails on both hands and on my feet. The presence of that blood, of that graphic nature, for us Mexicans, for us Latin Americans, it's very much a component of the landscape of seeing suffering in the iconography, particularly of Jesus, but also to a lesser extent of the various saints. Mexico has an extraordinary amount of saints, and many of those saints came to replace the indigenous idols and gods in a transcultural effort that which often meant that the Spaniards would build on the ruins or on the very foundations of a temple or a pyramid, the church or the convent or the religious institution. And likewise, they would replace Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl and the other idols and gods with the image of the new saint. And in the minds and hearts of the indigenous population, the replacement created all sorts of fascinating double visions. We are still praying to the idols of past, but we are also praying to the new saints that have acquired the anima of those old gods. And so that juxtaposition, that superimposition, that sense that a religion, the Mexican religion, is not built on the destruction per se of what was there before, but on the refashioning of the iconography. Destruction for sure, destruction of temples and the death and genocide of millions of people, but I'm particularly focusing on the imagery of the religious galaxy, or the entire orbit of icons and religious figures. That encounter in Spain allowed me to see that things at home were similar but very different too, in that there was another element that was also delicious and deliciously perplexing, in that I only understood what it was when I immigrated to the United States in the mid-'80s, in my mid-20s. And that is that Mexico celebrates the Day of the Dead, something that I did very innocently, very playfully when I was growing up with some neighbors and friends, really mostly invited as this Jewish kid who didn't know exactly where he was going, but the soccer friends would say, oh, come join us, we're going to spend the afternoon at the cemetery and eat a variety of foods and put some altars and they light some candles next to the tombs of our ancestors. I remember this as a very shocking moment because I had never been to a cemetery for the purpose of celebrating, laughing, dancing, eating joyfully next to the tomb of an ancestor. For me, and I had very clear memories of both my grandfathers dying. The cemetery was a place of sorrow, a heavy heart, the place where you didn't dare to smile. It was tears and pain that you felt, and where mostly you were silent. You did not speak out loud. You did not play with a guitar. You would not dance. And so visiting the cemetery during the Day of the Dead was a kind of cognitive dissonance moment for me. What exactly was this? And could the cemetery allow for such a moment? It would become for me a highlight that would push me to eventually in my career as a writer and as a thinker to explore the various aspects of my upbringing and of the culture in which I was part, and of the journey that I was doing away from those cemeteries, the Jewish cemetery, the Catholic cemetery, into the world, but always rooted in them. And like many of you, perhaps for a variety of reasons, in the last few years, I have lost a number of very dear people. My father, a very close friend, which have entailed returning to the cemetery and looking at the cemetery as a place where my blood is buried, where there are roots. I live very far away from the cemetery my father is buried, and my friend is buried. But it has pushed me to think time and time again, where is it that I should be buried? And what does it mean to be buried? And in what way am I being buried in a place that is where I arrived to, but not the place where I left or where I come from, means a correction against or to the immigration process that I started when I moved to the United States. And this makes me think also, friends, that in the journey that is the Jewish diasporas, we end up being buried in many different cemeteries, children away from their parents, grandchildren, and their successors. And very often, the journey to explore the past of one's family is the journey to see where the bobe or the zeide, the abuelo and the abuela are buried, and to feel the magnetism, the allure, the attraction of those places. I have gone to look for references in the Bible of heaven and hell in Jewish history. I'm not a biblical scholar, though I'm a passionate biblical reader. And I am always struck by the fact that Sheol makes such a marginal appearance. Of course, it is no secret, all of you know it in one way or another, that Judaism, the Jewish religion doesn't stress the afterlife, stresses the here and now. And the dictum is very clear from very early on. It is much more important a life of rightness, of conviction, and of social justice. And here, a single aspect of it, it is worth much more than any possibility of eternity or condemnation in the world to come. The world to come, Olam Haba, to come when? The idea that there is another world that waits for us, or that we wait for it, that is in the process of arriving or in the process of where we are supposed to go, and that it's not in the Jewish religion, in Jewish culture as well, as important, as emphasized as it is in other religions. I think to myself often, friends, why is it that Jews don't have a poem of the plasticity and complexity of the Divine Comedy of Dante? It's an extraordinary tourist visit to hell and to the inferno and to paradise. And it's incredibly vivid, because what Dante does in that book is almost with a GPS, tell us who is where and why and for how long. And Dante with his guide, Virgil, and depending on the canto and on the section, the drive through our Beatrice, are really journeying the way that Ulysses is journeying away and back from Ithaca. And in doing so, Dante has the opportunity, through beautiful terza rima and in a poetic power that has lasted for generations, to tell us who it was that mattered or didn't matter, who he ridiculed and satirized in his lifetime. Because what's very clear from the Divine Comedy, and what is very clear from other visions of heaven and hell, is what it becomes very obvious to any of us who are readers of science fiction. In science fiction, we create a future, not because the future itself is what matters, but because the future becomes a mirror of the present. What is it that we want to tell ourselves today, and how are we going to project it on the future? So 1984 by George Orwell is really, just as the title of the book makes it, the reverse of 1938 or 48. And you can see what he is projecting into the future by seeing the critique that he's making of the totalitarian state in the Soviet Union in particular. And the same thing with Brave New World or Fahrenheit 491, and so on and so forth, the Handmaid's Tale. The future as a mirror up to nature in Hamlet's vision. This is how we imagine what is going to come, because it's telling us who we are right now. And what Dante does in many ways is that he in the Divine Comedy, he's giving a statement of Florentine society, of the political infighting that he was part of and a victim of in his time, by using these different scales and layers of heaven, of hell, inferno, hell, and paradise. There are various moments in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, in Ecclesiastes, that we have a glimpse in biblical Judaism about what the actual place is. At some point, it can be defined as a pit or a land of forgetfulness. There's nothing that we Jews fear more than forgetting. And Sheol will be the place where we will no longer be capable of remembering, or simply a place of darkness. As if the world in which we live is a place of light, and that underworld is a place where there will be an absence of light. By absence of light is also the absence of warmth, of empathy, a place of solitude, and of isolation. I want to stress again something that all of us know: the very stingy descriptions that we have in the Bible about Sheol, about hell, and the almost absolute absence of references to heaven. I'm talking of the Hebrew Bible. Has much to do with the emphasis on the here and now, but doesn't completely eliminate the need that many of us today have of what was it that the biblical population imagined to be what would come after death. And there are moments in the Bible, think of Ezekiel, for instance, that there are visions of the chariots, of monsters coming, and of a glimpse of looking at God face to face as an incredibly powerful light that can enwrap you and subsume you and take your breath away and vanish you forever. And it is not surprising that Ezekiel in particular would become such an attractive description for Kabbalists and mystics later on, is this conception that either in your consciousness or the moment your soul separates from the body, there could be a kind of union mystica that would entail a total revamping of consciousness, of the sense of self, and of the coordinates that we have for ourselves on this earth. All this is an invitation again to think far beyond our confines, to think how poor, how limited, how restricted it is, the life we lead, but how exciting it is to the imagination that we have to envision other places. And of course, the biblical landscape is only one of the landscapes of Judaism. As Jews, after the destruction of the first temple, the catastrophe that entailed, the first diaspora, and then the destruction of the second temple in the year 70, and again the wandering to another diaspora, the sense of eschatology becomes much more concrete. And you have many more references. We have many more references in the Gemara and in the Mishnah, in the Talmud as a codex to what might happen in the world to come, though still in a stingy, I keep on using the word, in a stingy way that compared to others. And I use the word stingy here not as a criticism. I'm very comfortable with the fact that we Jews do not envision hell and heaven in a more complex, kind of three-dimensional way, but that we offer little meager references that nonetheless become fertile to the imagination. One of the important figures of the Sephardic period that invites the thought about what happens in the afterlife is Maimonides. And I'm going to just briefly say something about him in order to then go back to an anecdote of the Talmud that I'm very fond of, in that it gives us a bit more grounding and anchoring in the idea of the afterlife. It is in Maimonides that we have an Aristotelian view, or an attempt to reconcile the biblical conception of how the world was created, the role that God plays, with Aristotle's view that everything has to be rational, that there's a first force that created the world, and so on and so forth. And Maimonides is going to be very interested in his book, Morene Buchim, that is the Guide for the Perplexed, to try to bring together these very dissonant, very almost incompatible ways of seeing the world, the Aristotelian and the biblical. An effort, by the way, that wasn't his alone. Most Islamic or Muslim thinkers, Averroes, Ibn Sina, and others, and other Jewish thinkers, all in the Middle Ages, really put upon themselves this task of reconciling philosophy and the biblical thinking or faith. He has that famous document, which is his treatise on the resurrection of the dead, on reincarnation. And it is another important moment. Maimonides enters into a series of debates with different figures of his time. He feels compelled to write about the resurrection of the dead. He's convinced that once the body and the soul separate, the souls remain in one place and wait for what is to come. He connects it with the idea of Messianic Judaism, that there will come a time when the Messiah will arrive and all the dead will join the living in walking through Israel, through the promised land, when there will come harmony and equality and justice for all. And he makes this, the reincarnation of the dead, the resurrection of the dead, as they are not the same thing, as the 13th principle of faith, the 13th and last principle, that we all have to believe in one God, that the God is the creator, so on and so forth. And the 13th one is that the dead are going to resurrect. Ideas that, frankly, are almost incompatible. I would take away the word almost, incompatible to the way of life that we live today, most of us who are devoted to the life of the mind and who look at religion with certain skepticism. There's a particular anecdote in the Talmud that I am very fond of. And that is the episode of the 4 rabbis who enter the Pardes. It's in a number of places, as it happens in the Talmud, as it happens in the Bible. Things are never written linearly, and so a story can appear twice or 3 times or 4 times, and sometimes the repetition of these stories in different places, these anecdotes, will be modified in one way or another in the retelling. The same thing happens, for instance, in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In this particular story, the story of the Pardes, we are told that there are 4 rabbis that enter a place that is a garden that is called the Pardes. The Pardes has acquired a kind of mystical aspect for readers, and the 4 rabbis, each of them become emblematic of another response to the arrival to the Garden of Eden, to the return to the Garden of Eden, if that is what the Pardes is about, or to this mythical place, the Pardes, where these 4 individuals come back. 4 rabbis enter the Pardes. It almost sounds like 2 professors go into a bar. It's almost a joke. And in this joke, you get a very succinct, very limited biography of each of them. So succinct that if you only read that particular version of the story, you end up not knowing anything about them. Who Rabbi Akiva is, who Acher is, who Ben Sina, etc. They are only names. And we are told that these four rabbis who entered the Pardes suffered 4 different fates. That one of them entered and went mad, that a second one entered and died, a third entered and went astray, lost his path, and the fourth entered and came back. And the fourth is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is one of these extraordinary rabbis about whom we know very little, and yet becomes a constant leitmotif in rabbinical Judaism that has passed on to future generations. What is it that makes each of these rabbis have the outcome that they will have? It depends on how you read the story, depends on how much you know about each of them. But essentially, and I don't want to spend too much time on this unless we want to return to the story of the Pardes. Essentially, this is what happens when you get too close to knowledge. And when knowledge can have this fulminating effect on you. You can die, you can go mad, you can lost your path, and Acher in Hebrew means the other. His real name was Elisha ben Abuya, but the Talmudists are so mad that he lost his path that they decide not even to mention him by name in the Talmud, and he's only mentioned as the other. Remember, this is the same religion that imagines Sheol as the place of complete forgetfulness, and by using the word "the other" rather than naming him for who he is, we are choosing to place him in that kind of hell, which is not knowing, not being, not relating to the community, expelling you, exiling you. And the last one is Rabbi Akiva, who knows how to handle knowledge, comes out triumphant from this, and becomes a big leader of the Jewish community and of the rebellions against the Romans as well. The part that I'm interested in, I have written about this anecdote. I think often about this anecdote. I myself have done I didn't experiment with drugs when I was a young man. I was too rational. But in the last few years, particularly coming from Mexico, I have felt that I was banished from a certain type of knowledge that was available, particularly of the indigenous landscape, connected with religion. And I have participated in a ceremony connected with ayahuasca, with a hallucinogenic that was religious in nature, because I wanted to go beyond my own religious formation, my own connection with how I see the temple, rituals, prayers as moments in which I engage with God in trying to get to God through other ways. In many forms, for me, that experiment with ayahuasca, about which I wrote a play called The Oven, felt like the Pardes, like visiting the Pardes, like entering a forbidden, secluded place that where I could lose my mind or I could die, and I came close to both, and came back, I don't know if more knowledgeable, but certainly, I hope, more humble. There is in one of the references to the Pardes story, a slip of the pen by the Talmudic sages, where they dare to describe, not in incredibly graphic way, but in more substantial way, what is it that the four rabbis might see when they enter the Pardes? Now that's the part that I'm interested in. When they enter, I get it. One dies, one goes mad, etc. But what did they see? What is it that they saw on the other end? And there's one reference to a river that they see, and it's important to be not on this side of the river, but on the other one. Maybe it's the one of the rivers of the Garden of Eden that appears in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And there is a repetition of that water presence in another telling of the anecdote. Not much more. This is not Faulkner, this is not Garcia Marquez, this is not Dante. This is the Talmudic sages who write for exegetical reasons, for reasons that have to do with codifying a moral way of looking at the world, and not for any literary reasons, which is what I am bringing them forth here. I want to, there's a rapture and a rupture that takes place in Judaism in 1666, when with the major pseudo-messiah Shabtai Tzvi. There's a wonderful new Polish novel, by the way, connected with the descendants of this pseudo-messiah. It's called The Books of Job, The Books of Jacob. I highly recommend it. And there is, after that, a series of important events that happen, which is the ascendance of Hasidism and the revolution that entails, the idea that the traditional rabbis no longer hold control of Judaism, and that Judaism is not exclusively rational, that it can be mystical and can be based on storytelling. The Baal Shem Tov is the greatest of all revolutionary figures in that respect. And in tandem, parallel to it is the arrival of Haskalah, or the enlightenment in Judaism, that proposes that religion, in a very Spinozian way, proposes that religion is to be held in chains, that we need to go beyond, that we need to leave the ghetto and enter civil society, and that we have to go beyond conceptions of God and heaven and hell. And so what happens from the late 17th century, early 18th century to the present is that there is a dramatic diminution of reflections and depictions of heaven and hell in Jewish life. There are, one could say, I will say, dear friends, that Jean-Paul Sartre thought that hell is the others. Oh my God, we Jews can put a lot of that. And so maybe Elie Wiesel and Anne Frank and many of the literary giants of the Holocaust are doing nothing but offering us a very concrete description of what hell is, what the absence of paradise is, in the gas chambers, in the Auschwitz barracks, etc. Maybe also the conception of paradise is the idea that you can leave the place where you were born, and when in Sholem Aleicham's Tevye the milkman, Tevye the dairyman in other translations, the base of the musical Fiddler on the Roof, when they, after pogroms, xenophobic acts, a sense of fracture, in Anatevka, this mythical town, they finally decide that they are going to leave the place maybe that is what paradise is about, the idea of going somewhere else, somewhere where there's not going to be anti-Semites, where you're going to be happier, where you're going to be a better life. But again, what I'm interested here is less in conceptions of heaven and hell in our worlds. I can tell you that for me, heaven is reading Shakespeare, and hell is losing control. But that is not what I'm after again. It is only rarely that we have writers in the Haskalah, in the Enlightenment, and in the present who dare to bring us to the actual site of heaven and hell. And with this, I want to be wrapping up my thought. I want to give you two examples of two writers that do this, that to me are simply fascinating, particularly one of them. Let me go to the one that is also fascinating, but perhaps less so. It's a writer that I have been very connected with. I have edited his short stories, translated his work, and in the process of finishing a biography, Isaac Bashevis Singer, 1902, 1991, I believe, and the author of many novels, but really the best stuff that he left us is the many short stories. I edited 3 volumes for the Library of America of his short stories, including Gimple the Fool, perhaps one of the best short stories ever written in any language. Singer has a short story that was written in 1963, published in an anthology of Jewish science fiction called Wandering Star, that is called Yachid and Yedida. It's very short and very emblematic. It's the story of 2 souls that are in heaven or in hell. It's unclear where they are, but they have not yet been born. And yet this place, Sheol, if it's hell, maybe Gan Eden, if it's paradise, they live in a state of absolute purity. The story is about them descending into hell, the real Sheol, where Yachid finally finds Yedida in body, not only in soul. And what you throughout the end of the story, what you end up finding is that these 2 souls have actually just been born, become bodies, the bodies grow, and there's a kind of romantic relationship, almost love at first sight between them, because souls are matched in heaven or in hell, and what we do here is only react to the plan of God or react to the plan that was already set before us. It's not an incredibly sophisticated story. Bashevis Singer has better stories, but it's a very daring story because very few modernist writers dare to locate any of their fiction in the world to come, in the Olam Haba, or in Sheol or Gehenna, another version of hell. And Bashevis does it in this story in a way that I think allows us to see how this man became such an important figure in the link between Eastern European Yiddish literature and American literature, in presenting in modernist ways the folklore and tradition of the shtetl that was very much alive in his childhood. He was the child of an itinerant rabbi. He heard about mystics and Kabbalists, and at one point he considered himself a possible rabbi in the future. Highly recommended. But here is the last chapter of my talk, or section of my talk, and that's the other story. The other story, I can't get it out of my mind, dear friends. I would like to maybe do a graphic novel based on it, or a short animated movie. I've done 2 or 3, and it would be really an attractive idea. I have thought of adapting it into different contexts. In Yiddish, it's called Bonche Shvai. translated as Bonche the Silent. It's a story by a writer that is mostly known in Jewish circles, though to me stands as a real titan, a giant of a contemporary literature. His name is Isaac Leib Peretz, and considered to be, with Sholem Aleichem and with Abramovich, one of the three great fountains of Yiddish literature at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Peretz was an intellectual. He was a man committed to the socialist cause, very much Yiddishist. He not only wrote and thought in Yiddish, he thought that Yiddish was an ideology. My grandmother was very much into Peretz's view of the world. Yiddish is more than a language, is an ideology. And at the same time, Peretz had an astonishing nostalgia for the world of the Hasidim, the Hasidic masters in particular. And not the story of Bonche Schweig, but this other story called If Not Higher, or If Not Echer, is maybe 3 pages long. And it's exquisite. It's a story of a rabbi who's a Litvak, meaning a Lithuanian in the context of the Pale of Settlement. The Lithuanians were the skeptics, the ones that would put in question everything. And this rabbi, who's a skeptic, is told often about a woman who is very poor, and he disappears. The rabbi disappears on Shabbat, on Saturdays, on the Sabbath. And this other Litvak is not sure where this rabbi goes, and so decides to follow him. The Litvak follows the rabbi on Shabbat, and he sees that the rabbi, as soon as the Shabbat arrives, changes off his clothes. He dresses like a peasant, goes into the middle of the forest. The woman, who's very sick, can barely get out of her bed. He enters the house and helps her throughout those days, those hours, only to leave her, return, acquire the clothes of the rabbi again, and come back to life. And when the Litvak who followed him, who went into the bed just to see if the rabbi is having an affair or if the rabbi is abandoning religion or doing anything, what is it that he's doing? When that skeptic, when that Litvak is asked, where did the rabbi go? Did he go to heaven on Shabbat? He responds that famous line at the end, if not hecher, if not higher. And that famous line at the end is very emblematic, because what Peretz is saying here is that there's a place higher than heaven. And that place might not be geographical. It has to do with justice. It has to do with the tshuva, with morality, but it also has to do, the story, with a longing for a past where even the most intellectual of writers, Peretz, and the most skeptic of skeptics, a Litvak, can agree that a rabbi will be saintly, really saintly, that will have magical powers. This is extending too long, and I want to go to the final story, Bonche Schweig. Bonche Schweig, if you remember anything of my lecture, is that I ask you to go and read this story and see how you navigate it. It's a story of a man, Bonche, who was silent throughout his life. He never spoke. He suffered like nobody else, but never raised his voice. He didn't have enough food. He was mistreated in every job that he has. He was thrown out. He lost his family, and he never raised his voice. And when he died, nobody in this world even noticed it. Bonche Schweig dead. That's the first page of the story. The rest of the story is that the moment von Zweig arrives to heaven, heaven is in utter and complete celebration. Von Zweig has arrived. The von Zweig, who else but this man who was able to be silent throughout life, who was able to be himself throughout the worst ordeals. The angels, the prophets, Moses himself are all joyful in celebration of the arrival of von Zweig. And you as a reader, the reader of Peretz, when the story was first published in 1894, we in 2022 cannot quite understand the discrepancy between what happens on earth and what happens in heaven. The final line of the story is that he's supposed to go through the judgment of God in the court, the higher court. And they say that this is only going to be a formality. After all, it's von Zweig. God himself has been waiting for this man who didn't speak a single word. And then the court says to von Zweig, what is the reward that you would like to have? What is it that we can do for you that would satisfy you after the type of life that you led? And Bonche, in the very last paragraph, and in the very first of the story, and in the first moment of arrival to heaven, goes quiet and thinks. And then he says, well, what I would like to have is just a hot meal every morning. A hot piece of bread with some butter. And everybody laughs. And that's the end of the story. And the story has been looked at from such different perspectives. Could it be a socialist story? Making fun of heaven? No, don't wait for our reward. They are going to offer you there the same thing that we didn't offer you here. A hot piece of bread, is that what you're waiting for? Maybe it's a religious story, a kind of a fable or parable about righteousness and clear morality, where those that are seen as shadowy and unimportant are the just, the righteous, and it is said that every generation, for the world to exist, needs those righteous people who are often not the ones that call attention to themselves in order for the world to continue. What is it exactly that Peretz is telling us in this story? And is there a way to see his authorial, modernist, skeptical approach? Is Peretz himself making fun of Bonche? Is he celebrating silence? I have taught this story with different audiences in different parts of the world. And in Israel, they believe that Bonche is an example of the diaspora. He never spoke out. He never fought back. With a group of rabbis in Cincinnati, the answer was that this is a very un-American attitude, that here you speak out, here you fight back. And they felt uncomfortable with this story. The Yiddishists, I've taught it at the Yiddish Book Center, celebrated the story as a story that connects the Hasidic past with the modernist present of Peretz. I don't want to solve it. I think that I can't solve it. The reason why I'm so attracted to the story is that I keep on going back and seeing a different interpretation of it. But what attracts me so much to it is not only what it says about silence and perplexity and reward, but how it maps paradise, how it maps the afterlife. how it says that when we die, there is, from this perspective of parents, really one of the biggest rationalist minds, modernist minds, a place you go where there might be some sarcasm, some irony, that paradise might not be the place of absolute purity and straightforwardness and clear eyes, but a place where even God and Moses and the prophets and the angels might laugh, not fully understanding who a person like Boncheshvik is. I wrap this up, friends, to tell you that maybe the only option that those of us who are readers of literature and of religious literature have in terms of heaven and hell is the excursions that theologians and narrators and poets allow us in envisioning this two places. That even though Judaism is not inclined to emphasize the afterlife, there are hints and suggestions here or there that tell us about the implacable, overwhelming, disorienting, and ultimately silencing power that those experiences might entail. And more than anything, I can say that what attracts me to this tourist journey to these places is the fact that the only thing that we really have is the language to recreate them. A language that is imperfect, that changes from diaspora to diaspora, and that in the end is only a glimpse. One of the great philosophers of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, an Austrian Jew, said once, it's often repeated, that the limits of my language are the limits of my world, and that which cannot be said does not exist. I think that by using the language that we have to envision heaven and hell, we try to see what are the limits of our language and also the limits of our consciousness. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. And Ilan, I assume you're willing to take a few questions?
Of course.
Okay, great. Well, let me invite people to just unmute themselves and speak up, or if you feel more comfortable, you can raise your little hand, your cyber hand, and I'll see it. It'll come up to the left side of the screen. If you want to put it in the chat box, I'm happy to read that for Dr. Stavans to comment on. So please, the floor is open.
Using the time to serve myself a little water here.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so if nobody else wants to start,
Go ahead, Andy.
can I say something, Ellen?
Please, Andy.
So Professor Stavans, you when you talk about Hasidim, the headquarters is in the central Ukraine. Is there some Jewish connection between the Jewish past and the Ukrainian present?
Andy, there absolutely is, because the Jewish past is the Jewish present. We live with the constant memory of those that came before us, and with the conviction that we are contemporaries. One of the images that is central to Judaism is that each generation that is born was already at Mount Sinai and shares the same experience. My own family, Andy, comes from Lithuania, the Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. I was mentioning this morning that I have ambivalent feelings toward these places because of the way my own ancestors ran away from them, escaping. But in my initial reaction to many of the histories that came to me as a child and as an adolescent from them was that they didn't want to talk too much about Poland. My grandmother, for instance, my maternal grandmother, the moment she left Poland, promised never to use the word of Polish again. For her, that was the biggest revenge that she could imagine. And she resorted to Yiddish and to the very limited Spanish that she had. And that meant that she didn't have a way to communicate with others that didn't speak Yiddish. But that was a stronger feeling that communicating in Polish, because Polish had aborted her, had pushed her out. But the more I mature, the closer I get to the end of the journey, the more I think of the choices that many of those ancestors made or were forced to make. And the more I try to see them not only as refugees or escapees or immigrants, but as complex figures that must have had a different moment, ambivalence themselves through those places. I recently wrote my mother, before she entered the state of oblivion, which is the Alzheimer's condition in which she is, managed to tell me a few things. And one is that her grandfather survived the Second World War, but was shot by a loose and a drunken Nazi the day after liberation. All the family had either died already or had left. He and one of his children, who was handicapped, had hidden during the war. And the day after the war, news got to my mother and to her family that he was shot. And I have tried to, that image was very strong in me. And I have tried to imagine what that drunk Nazi was, and what he had experienced hiding, and what he felt toward the place where his own parents had been buried and his grandparents. All this to tell you, Andy, that I'm absolutely shaken, like you are probably, by what is happening. Feels like 1939, what is happening right now, and by the arrival of strong men, not only in Russia, I was going to say the Soviet Union, but in the United States, where our former president can celebrate Vladimir Putin as a great leader, even right now. There is a great connection with the Ukraine then and now, because we never know as Jews where the next diaspora will take us. And it could take us back to Ukraine in 100 years. It could take us back to Spain in 200 years. It could take us back to places where we ran away from. If it's not going to be Mars or Jupiter or the next galaxy, you never know where the next diaspora is. And so the roots of the past are always the roots of the present.
Kaylee, you want to ask?
Yes, hi, I do have a question. Hi, Professor Stavans, bienvenido.
Hola,
My name
gracias.
is Keely Maxey. My name is Keely Maxey, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to ask you a question. So I've consulted your many books and book reviews in my research on Mexican Jewish root seeking throughout my master's degree. And I'm currently working on my master's thesis, which concerns Sephardic and Converso root seeking in the Americas today, post 1992, 500
Wonderful.
year expulsion. So anyways, my question is the following. So I could pick your brain all day long, but I would like to take advantage of the opportunity to ask one question, to ask you about the roots of Diego Rivera, because I've gone to great lengths to discover the origin of this idea that Rivera claimed Sephardic or Converso ancestry.
Yep.
And, you know, I have this nice book, City of Palaces,
Yep.
with this remarkable illustration
Right.
of
Rivera.
we presume Jew in the Inquisition. Yes,
Right.
exactly. Which to me suggests that he was aware of the Converso story. And so my question is, did he claim Jewish ancestry? If so, why? And if not, double why? Why are people, biographers, autobiographers, projecting this identity onto him? That's my
Kylie,
question.
thank you very much for your terrific question. I salute the topic that you have chosen for you said your master's, and I'm hoping that it will become part of a doctoral quest that you might embark as well. It's wonderful, and there is plenty to do there. And I get excited when young people go to this part of the world and look for the traces and the connections that you are doing. Wonderful. Both Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo are very enigmatic and emblematic figures when it comes to their Jewish identity. Frida Kahlo, and I will very quickly say something about her, claimed throughout her life that her father was Jewish, but we know that that was more the fiction that she wanted to create than the reality, which is that his father, if at all, descended from 3 generations of people who had converted to Christianity and did not identify himself as a Jew. But she prolonged this opinion that he was. She found, if you want it, and some people have, the propensity to suffering, the connection between the suffering and the body, and the way that she is obsessed with self-portraits. There is a kind of Jewish sensibility in all of it. But you could also say that there are other sensibilities that are apparent in her work. I'm not saying that Frida Kahlo is Jewish, but I'm saying that Frida Kahlo liked to say that her father was Jewish, and liked to say it with some frequency. And she met and stayed with, in a very abusive relationship with Diego Rivera, who himself had a complex relationship with the Jewish past. He paints characters of the Inquisition with San Benito's, Carvajal, in the murals. He connects with this writer that the book that you have of Itzhak Berliner, a Yiddish writer that doesn't speak a word of Spanish, and he illustrates his book of poetry. The poetry is really not very good. What that book is, the reason it is important is because Diego Rivera decided to make some drawings for it. But how did Diego Rivera understand the poems? Who translated them for him? And why is it that on a number of opportunities, he stressed that his ancestors came from conversos who had been sacrificed at the stake, burned at the stake by the Inquisition, and very much connected with the inquisitorial history through the side of the victim. There is much work for there to do, and that is why you're here. I can tell you that the pathos and the zeitgeist, both of them, in both Frida Kahlo and Diego, extend beyond these 2 connections that I just made. When the They emerged as muralists, as painters in the 1920s and 1930s in Mexico, just as the Jewish Ashkenazi immigration is arriving. They live in places where they are constantly exposed to those indigent Poles and Russians and Belarusians that are just arriving. They see the plight of the immigrant as something they identify with and for. And when Trotsky is expelled from the Soviet Union and has to look for a place where to seek refuge in order to survive Stalin's mighty fist, they are the ones, together with Orozco, one of the other muralists, that convinced the Mexican government to open the doors for Trotsky to come. Trotsky stays in their house, they become defenders, and they see the Jewish side of Trotsky as the one that they feel that it's not only Trotsky's politics, but the politics of this Jew that is escaping and needs refuge. So I think that one of the aspects, the reason why I'm stressing this is because I think one of the aspects of the next generation of scholars is to go beyond the data of, did they say that they were Jewish, and what did they paint in this mural, and why did they do the Berliner book, to try to explore more deeply through their correspondence, through their interviews, and through the larger historical landscape of the period. Why is it that they made that connection with the Jews? Had they, with Jewishness, with the Jews, the Jew as pariah, the Jew as vulnerable, the Jew as being expelled? I think that 30 years later, had they been around, they would have had a very different position. The Jew at that point, the Eastern European Jew, is this very delicate, easy to push around character that they like to emphasize and connect with. The zeitgeist is going to change soon. Immigrants are going to become more affluent in Mexico. The politics of socialism and Trotskyism are going to change. Trotsky is going to be killed in Mexico shortly after. So there's all sorts of elements there that are very important, but it's a fertile ground of research.
Absolutely. Thank you for that wonderful answer. I appreciate it. And thanks for your talk.
Thank you. My pleasure. Congratulations on your good work.
Yeah, we have one more student with their hand up, and Ilan, can we?
Absolutely.
Okay, AJ, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for your great talk, and I'm fascinated by your background. Your talk reminded me of this story out of Luke, and I was wondering if you were familiar with it. Luke 16, beginning at verse 19, with the rich man and Lazarus, and Jesus speaking of this, I guess, scene or this interaction happening between Abraham and this man in hell. So I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts on that and see what you had to say.
Thank you, AJ. I'm less familiar with the New Testament than I am with the Old Testament. I'm familiar with that story, and I'm also familiar with other episodes of eschatology, but my ignorance is such that wouldn't allow me to say anything that I think would be of interest. One of the things, maybe this would be of interest to you, AJ. It wasn't until I left Mexico and came to the United States and I became a professor. It's a word that I don't like. It makes me feel scientific. That I started reading in earnest the Christian Bible. When growing up, I knew about the Christian Bible, but I was never encouraged to read it because it was the Hebrew Bible, the one that defined our lives. And I'm in many ways a new student of the Christian Bible as a result. I have made myself one because I teach a course that I created, so it's my fault. that is it's a history of God in different periods and how the visions that we have of God change. It's a very complex course. It's a very popular course, and every time I teach it, I am humbled by the amount of things that I don't know, which I find to be one of the most exciting parts of being a teacher. So I am telling you here that I have read that piece, but I don't feel enough of a solid intellectual grounding in order to reflect in meaningful ways, aside from recognizing my ignorance.
Thank you. That was a tremendous response. And I think that your humbleness on this topic is very honorable.
Thank you.
Ilan, I have one question from a shy student, and she doesn't want to ask it herself, but you brought it up, so I think it's fair game.
Sure.
And that is, seeing as you've talked a lot about Jewish relationship with cemeteries, visiting the departed, how so very often, as you say, we're really not buried near our parents or grandparents, and that's pretty common, I think, in the Jewish experience. The student would like to know, have you thought about where you would like to be buried, and would you share that?
Sure. I thank the student very much for that question, and I thank you, Alan, for being the conduit to that question. I think more and more about that question. I'm 60. I come from a family where, to the best of my knowledge, men died in their 50s up until my father's generation. There was no man that reached 55. And so I'm an old man, not only today, but I'm an old man in the context of my family. I'm 60. And I have spent a generous amount of time in my last 30 years going to cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries in different parts of the world, especially cemeteries where I might have some stake. In Warsaw, in Belarus, in Mexico City, in Veracruz. And then this has become a kind of habit. Almost the first place I go when I arrive to a new city or a new town is a cemetery. I thought maybe there's a morbid side in me, but it's not that I want to see the dead. It's what I want is that I want to see what the living do with the memory of the dead. I wander around the tombs. I read them. I touch the stone. If it's someone I connect to, I put little pebbles on them, and then I try to see histories, how people keep cemeteries, how are the cemeteries built, what kind of order is there in death, and what do the dead say to the living. I'm especially interested in crypto-Jews, conversos, and I love going to cemeteries in New Mexico, in Texas, in Colorado, and trying to see what the families of conversos hide or don't hide in tombs, hands, or candelabros, or iconography of lions, or angels, stars of David. The dead communicate with us all the time. You enter a library. The library is an incredible conversation that you have with the dead. People coexisting, different stages. This is the division that exists in my mind, Alan and student of Alan. at times I think, why should I worry about this? My children would take care of it. The dead don't longer say anything. It's the living that do something with them. And then I say, well, but the dead do make wishes before they become dead, and they can decide where they sit or where they don't sit. And so, I have spent 30 years of my life in Amherst, Massachusetts. I never thought for a second that I would be here this long. I love this place, though I don't know if this place is home. I lived 22 years in Mexico. I thought that it was home. Now it has less time in the clock that is my life. And when I go to Mexico now, it doesn't feel like home. It feels like it's a very different Mexico from the one that I left.
Mhm.
So I don't know, likely wherever something happens, whenever I die, whatever decision others are going to make about me, I don't know if that's going to be home or not. I do think about it. At some moments, I would like to be buried next to my parents and my grandparents. But now, more than ever, I want to be buried next to my wife, who is in Amherst too, and who also comes from different places. Maybe that's going to be home. That has been home. One of the biggest questions that I ask myself, and you're going to say, this guy is really, is what should be the language of my tombstone? Hebrew, Spanish, Spanglish? Should it be crossed out, had a typo, or be in translation? Should it not have anything written on it? To me, that is, after all, is what I do when I go to cemeteries, try to read the tombs, what they say and they don't say. I don't know either. I don't know if it's going to be my decision, Alan, but I think of the language of the dead and the language that they communicate. And I can tell you, my father, as I mentioned in the morning, was a soap opera actor, a telenovela actor. And he was the happiest man on stage. Not in front of the camera, but on stage. In that has always pushed me to think that theater is the most complete of all arts, because it's in the present tense. The performance happens right in front of an audience, and it's unique and irreplaceable. It doesn't happen with literature, it doesn't happen with movies or television. But I think that the best that we writers do is try to hope that one word or one line or one paragraph of what we leave behind will have some value, though it's unlikely, honestly and humbly, to have it, because the time goes very fast and people have less and less attention. And but those are tombs in different ways as well. The tombs of the libraries, maybe more fitting, more domestic, more comfortable.
Ilan, all I can say after that is that you, of all people, surely must follow the tradition of more than one language on your tombstone. And I'm going to ask my colleagues to just thank you for a wonderful evening. And Misha, you might not get the last word tonight, but you'll get the first word on Wednesday, okay?
Thank you all very much for your patience and for your warmth and invitation, Alan, Misha, Daniel, everybody. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.